doing it.
Thank you.
It's Linda, just in case.
Okay, folks, before we kick off our presentation, I want to mention that this is being sponsored by the local and new chapter of the John Birch Society. Linda
Is the team leader.
is our chapter leader.
Dave
Duvall. I almost called her Patrick Duvall one time, and I didn't.
Whoa.
So we want to thank and Camp Constitution actually paid for the room. That's another entity, and it's free admission. But it's a little pricey for a nice place like this, so we're going to sort of pass the hat. And if you want to write a check, make it out to Camp Constitution. And let's see. Okay, we're gonna, before we kick off, I want to bring up Reverend Stevie Kraft to open in prayer. And Reverend Kraft is coming up from New Jersey. He is a JBS member of the John Birch Society and also instructor at Camp Constitution. And we have a table next door at the homeschool show. That's what brings us. That's what brings him here. So please let us all stand and let Reverend Kraft open in prayer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
Quoting from the German theologian Martin Luther, he said, quote, "I am afraid that schools will prove to be the gates of hell unless they diligently labor in explaining the Holy Scriptures, engraving them in the hearts of youth. Therefore, I advise no one to place his child where the Scriptures do not reign paramount."
Amen.
Amen. He was prophetic when he said that. How much more today in the 21st century do we see the truth of that prophecy being played out in government schools? That's why this presentation that Dr. Pesta does is so important. Like Brother Hal said, no one will fall asleep in here. In fact, when you leave here, not only will you be educated, but you may be very angry. But remember the words of Jesus, be angry and sin not. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come in the mighty majestic name of our Lord and Savior, Christ Jesus, Son of the living God. Father, your word declares in James chapter 1, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives liberally to all who ask, but if they ask in faith without doubting. Father, we're in perilous and treacherous times today in our nation. We are losing our nation because we have lost our biblical moorings. We've lost our spiritual foundation. We have gone astray. And you said the wicked shall be turned into hell and all nations that forget God. But we thank you for brothers and sisters you raised up, like Dr. Duke Pesta, that has come to sound the alarm and to let us know that hope is not lost if we have ears to hear and eyes to see. And that if we will take what we learned tonight and apply it, not only in our own lives, but the lives of our precious children and our grandchildren, leaving a legacy and a heritage for righteousness' sake. We come against every principality of hell, for this is a spiritual war. We come against those who would not only dumb down our kids, but to indoctrinate them in satanic ideology. And we pray, Father, tonight that the eyes of our understanding will be opened and that we will leave this place not depressed because of this Common Core nonsense, but we will leave here with a vision to move forward and to see righteousness restored once again in our great land. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Oh, yes.
Okay, we can be seated, and I want to just recommend some items we have on the table in the back. And by the way, the facilities go to the right and go right across if you need to use the restrooms. The New American Magazine, published by the John Birch Society, is a bi-monthly publication. We have a special reprint which contains 2 articles. It has those devices they use to get the child's responses from, so that little article about that. You can take one free. If you want more, they're 3 for $1. And I know we're all activists, so you should all grab plenty of them, right? I have a 1-hour DVD with Duke Pesta and his colleague, Mrs. Mary Black. It's about a year and a half old. These are $2 a piece, and they're available out there. That's also on YouTube. You just put in Duke Pesta on YouTube. There's going to be like 1,000 videos. You might have a 5-minute video. You might have a 5-hour one, right? So they're all good. My dear friend Sam Blumenfeld couldn't make it today. He's now 89 years of age. He's a pioneer in the homeschool movement. And back in the 60s, he realized there was a serious reading problem. He's authored about 15 books in his useful life. His last one is Crimes of the Educators. Now, this is my only copy. I just got it from Sam a couple of days ago. It's available. It's published by WorldNet Daily, and it's available on Amazon. I highly recommend it if you're real, want to be knowledgeable. This doesn't deal with Common Core. It deals with what led up to Common Core. It didn't just happen overnight. It happened over 100 years ago, folks. People like John Dewey and Horace Mann and all these other folks that most of us, until recently, probably never heard of. Sam put together something called Alpha Phonics many years ago to teach not just children, but also adults how to read using intensive phonics. Sam would say, you don't need puppets popping out of trash cans to teach people how to read. He said you use, now we homeschooled 5 of my children, we all taught my children, my wife and I, using this simple step-by-step method. And there's not one picture in here, and not one puppet popping out of a trash can. I got a few of these available, they're only $10. And even adults who have trouble reading can learn from this. And finally, the entity paying for this room is Camp Constitution. Reverend Kraft is one of our instructors, and maybe one day we'll have Duke, hopefully sometime, maybe next year. It's a week-long summer camp. It's in Ringe, New Hampshire. It's an all-volunteer entity, and we've never turned away any worthy campers or any worthy families. We've had a really good reception. We're across the street at the homeschool convention. And you'll see a lot of homeschool people here because of half of them are staying here tonight. So anyway, make yourself available a lot of information. And I'm going to introduce Dave Drake, who's the outreach director at Freedom Project Education. He'll introduce Duke. And the Freedom Project Education is our educational offshoot of the John Birch Society. I just have one warning. Duke Pesta is a Shakespeare scholar, and he actually thinks Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. But we'll overlook that minor character flaw. Thank you. Dave?
Thanks, Al. It's good to be here. I don't usually have the opportunity to travel with Duke because he's going, whenever he flies, we try to keep the cost down for those people that are going to listen to him, so I don't usually get to drive. It worked out this time because we actually have a booth over at the conference too, and so we have our full van, we have our full booth, and so I get to be part of one of the long ones. Duke and I originally started this probably back in 2013. We started going around Wisconsin, and we did 125, 130 talks just in Wisconsin before it started getting out of Wisconsin, and then he started flying, and now he's been in almost 40 states. So it's been exciting to do that. Duke does, he's a full professor at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh. So he does that full time. He's also the academic director of Freedom Project Education. We're an online school. We have brochures up here if you're interested. As Hal said, this was an idea of a number of the people that were with the John Birch Society. Alan Scholl, who's been with JBS for, I think, almost 30 years. I was homeschooled for 29 years. He had this idea to how do we bring educated our professors or type people to help homeschoolers. And the idea went from there. We've been in school for 4 years now. We started with 22 high school students 4 years ago. We were just short of 600 this year. We're planning on to be somewhere between probably 900 and 1,000 this year because we're just growing so fast. Common Core wasn't something we intend to ever play off from, but it's working well for us. So if parents want, we're probably not the solution for every family, but we can be the solution for many, many families. And we can do individual classes. If mom wants to teach one of your classes, dad wants to teach a class, we can help out with the extra classes that they don't want to teach. Or if the family situation is that you want us to do the full curriculum, we can do that K through 12. Okay? We are an accredited school, and so we are certainly an option for families across the United States. We are in 50 states now and about 9 countries. So we're not just tied to just the United States. We work very well with missionaries, families who want English taught by somebody that knows English. American history, American studies are classes we offer. Logic, Latin, and philosophy are also the thinking classes from a Christian perspective. So again, the brochures are here if you'd like, and then we have a few of these program guides which have all of our class listings. We'll take enrollments through August 14th or when the classes are full. We already have 4 sections of classes full at this point. So, so it's going very quickly. As I said, Dr. Pesta is also our academic director. Besides that, virtually every weekend that's not a holiday weekend or basically a holiday weekend, Duke has been on the road. So he does the traveling. I try to make sure that he doesn't get stuck in an airport. So at this time, I'm going to introduce Dr. Pesta to come up and talk about how things have changed since the last time you've heard from him.
Thank you very much for taking a Friday evening and being here. I appreciate it. We have done a lot of Common Core talks. We've been all over the place. I'm gratified to say that in 2.5 years of doing this, everything we said was going to happen is happening. Everything the people who support Common Core told you was going to happen isn't happening. This wasn't state-led. It's not improving our kids' education. The tests are a disaster. They can't even administer the tests, let alone have fair tests. Revolts all across the country, moms and dads beginning to speak out. So what I'd like to do is take you through a good overview where I'm going to tell you who did it, how they did it, why they did it, and then we're going to look at the standards and get a sense of why these are so dangerous. We do have homeschool people here, and I'm grateful. I assume because if you're a homeschool person or you were at the convention and you're here, it's because you recognize that if the federal government is indeed taking over public school education, not to educate but to indoctrinate, and that's what this is. If that's happening, then they're not going to let you alone. A lot of homeschool moms and dads are what I like to call bunker moms and dads. And I understand the sentiment entirely. Thank God we've got our kids safe at home. We're not exposing them to this. But then we sort of turn our backs on what's happening in the larger culture, and sooner or later, once they sew everything up, they're not going to let you guys alone. So it's one of these things that we're going to, I want homeschool to burgeon, but we've got to have moms and dads in homeschool who are still actively fighting this in the culture, so you can, not for the culture, but for your families. And so your kids and your grandkids can homeschool one day if they want to. So let's start real broad. First of all, can everybody in the back see okay? Do we need to dim the lights at all? You all right? Okay. Let's start with what Common Core is. Oh, one last thing, I didn't hear Hal mention it. In order to get you on a Friday night out of here early without having to keep you too long, let's hold our questions till the end. This way, anybody who wants to stay and ask them can, and I'll stay as long as you need me to. But if we ask questions every 4 or 5 minutes, you can be here for 4 hours and you don't want that. So, what is Common Core? Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative, a set of national standards for English and math. Science is already being fed into your schools. Every aspect of your kids' curriculum in the public schools will be Common Core aligned, including art, music, physical education. I've seen a prototype for the new Common Core physical education standards. Your kids are going to be writing in gym class more than they're actually exercising. And the things they're writing about Michelle Obama's nutrition program, right? How to eat health. This is the kind of stuff that every aspect of the curriculum is going to be revamped. And this is really dangerous. Massachusetts, you took the English and math standards. You did not agree to any other standards. You took English and math. And yet, simply by virtue of taking those 2 standards, every subsequent standard will be dumped into your schools without consulting you now. You didn't agree to anything else, but you're going to get it all now. And that's a big problem. So transparency matters. They call themselves the Common Core State Standards because they want you to believe the states did this. But a simple question to start with. If states did it, Common Core, shouldn't the states be able to walk away? If this is genuinely state-led, states should be able to get out of it, right? And what happens to every state that tries to pull out of Common Core? The federal government threatens and blackmails them. You've, I'm sure, heard about all over the country how moms and dads are opting their kids out of these tests. Y'all heard that? Well, I don't know if you're aware of this. I haven't even had time to put it in the slide. When I get home, I'm going to add it to the slide presentation. 3 days ago, Arne Duncan, the Secretary of Education in Washington, he came out and said, if moms and dads keep opting their kids out of our tests, the federal government will have to intervene to make them take those tests. Please tell me how this is state-led. Already, homeschool states that require testing are starting to transform the requirements to force homeschool moms and dads to take Common Core tests. Oh, you can still homeschool, But now the tests you take to verify will have to be Common Core tests. None of this is state-led. So why do they call it state-led? I guess the question is, why did they call the Affordable Care Act affordable? I mean, nobody believed it then, and no one believes it now. Everybody knows it's going to be expensive and more expensive. But whenever the federal government appropriates to itself things it has no business doing, they always give it these kind of names. This is an important lie. What you're going to get today is the top 5 or 6 lies of Common Core that you've been told again and again. It's almost like mantra-like hypnosis. Common Core is rigorous. Common Core is benchmarked. Common Core is state-led. None of it's true. And I should say, too, as we open here, every single piece of information you're going to see today, it's going to be documented. And I'm going to give it to you free. All you have to do is grab a card from me or from Dave. We'll email you all the slides. So every piece of information you're going to see you can have for free. I urge you to take it and verify it. I mean, we're in this problem because we trust people we don't know. You don't know me. So I'm not asking for your trust. I'm asking you to listen. In 350 talks in 40 states, nobody has ever written back to me and said, that's not true. So when you're done here today, not only will you understand exactly what Common Core is and how it works, but I'm going to give you all of our information, all of the documentation. Take it, have it, use it. Because the people who tell you Common Core are all those wonderful things, they never prove it. Your principal says, oh, it's rigorous. Ask them, please, how could they know Common Core is rigorous when right now in your Massachusetts schools they're testing it for the first time? It hasn't been tested in 6 years since they conceived it. How can they tell you it's rigorous when they haven't even begun to test it yet, but they've been telling you for 6 years? Hold your politicians, hold them accountable the same way. When they tell you it's better than what we have, and you're the one state in the union that I can honestly say it's not better. You had the best standards in the country. And Deval Patrick and the Secretary of Education threw them away for about $400 million and took these ridiculous Common Core standards. You had world-class standards in this state, and you trashed them for this. You knew those standards worked. By trial, by evidence, by test, by college application and enrollment, you knew they worked. You gave them away for this, for a big bucket load of federal money and the crony relationship between Patrick and Barack Obama. That's why you did it to your kids. And if there's one aspect of Common Core that is unforgivable, it's how our superintendents, our principals, our state school leaders, if we can call them that, the DPI, the Department of Public Instruction, and the federal government, how they have given away our kids' educational standards and replaced them with something that is very broad and very shallow. We're going to talk about it. But they call them the state standards. That's the first lie of Common Core. Let me prove to you that it's not state-led, because this is a big one. If it's state-led, then we should be able to walk away, and the states control it. They've gotten moms and dads to think that maybe it's okay if the states did it. Well, who wrote them? 2 Washington lobbyist groups. Shocking, I know, but that's who did it. These 2 groups, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. Now that all sounds very impressive, especially see, Pesta, that's where it's national. That's where it's state-led, right? The governors did it. Who is the NGA? If you go to their website, you will find that the National Governors Association is a trade organization, a lobbyist group. Their purpose is to put donors and politicians into contact with each other. Lobbyists, politicians, and donors. It's a lobbying group. Their own website acknowledges that. Let me prove to you that the governors didn't do this. Does anybody know who the sitting governor of the NGA, the honorary chair of the NGA was for a good deal of time that Common Core was being put in your schools? Not Chris Christie.
Arkansas governor.
All good guesses. It was the governor of Oklahoma, Mary Fallin. And what's really important about that is about a year ago, Mary Fallin, the governor of Oklahoma, pulled Oklahoma completely out of Common Core. And she said one of the main reasons she did it is because the states weren't consulted. See, I really do, I wish 50 state governors locked themselves in a room and banged out education standards. Now, that strikes you as incongruous. What qualifies your governor to write academic standards? Nothing. I've got the most conservative governor in the country, it's Scott Walker. He's not qualified to write education standards. None of your governors are. So why do I prefer that? Because if the governors did it, you could always unelect the governor, can't you? You have some democratic representation. If the governors did it, you control the governors ultimately. here's the copyright for Common Core. Please tell me how Common Core is state-led. When the copyright itself tells you these two lobbyist groups wrote it, the MGA Center and the CCSSO shall be acknowledged as the sole owners and the sole developers of the Common Core state standard. And by the way, you see the hypocrisy? Neither one of these two things has anything to do with the states. They're private, K Street, Washington lobbyists. And yet, they named the program, they completely wrote and developed, they call them the state standards. You can see this federal bait and switch over and over again. And so that begs another question. If two Washington lobbyist groups did it and not the states, how can you say it's federal? One thing you need to know right when we start, people ask me this all the time, well, if the federal government wanted to take over education, why didn't they just do it the way they took over health care? Because legally they couldn't. 3 different federal statutes dating from 1965 prohibit the federal government of the United States from establishing national standards or national curriculum. To say nothing of the fact that the 10th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the federal government from meddling in state educational decisions. Those are the reasons they couldn't do it. There was nothing like that for Obamacare. So what they did, the next best thing, they allowed these 2 lobbyist groups with a lot of money and a lot of help to write the standards and copyright them so that they could say, they're not federal, we're not breaking the law, these are state-led. That's how they work this. And that's pretty shocking if you think about it. And look at this from another respect, too. American education is public. It belongs to you and me. Our kids and grandkids are the stakeholders. Everything depends on them. And yet, you've got unelected, unaccountable people who you can't reach. Massachusetts, if you decide you don't like that, how do you reach these people? The governors, at least, you can call their office and demand and run a candidate against them. How do you get to these people? And I'm going to stop using the term public education because it's not public education anymore. This is government education. That's what's happened here. And what they've done through the copyright is hide that fact. And I don't know why it took 6 years, but we now have our first state governor, Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, who's suing the federal government because this is illegal, what they've done. You can masquerade any way you want, but it's still illegal. And 16 different state governors are considering joining Jindal's lawsuit. Alas, your governor's not one of them. I'm sure that surprises you. We go back here.
I'm not surprised.
So where'd they come from? You got these 2 Washington lobbyist groups. And the irony is that there really were only 5 people, 5, in those 2 lobbyist groups who did the bulk of the writing of the standards. And at lower levels, people pitched in. But in fact, I see some of you taking notes. The name I would ask you to write down is Joy Pullman, P-U-L-L-M-A-N. Joy works for the Heartland Institute in Chicago, and she has written a definitive article on the 5 people who wrote Common Core. This wasn't done by states, it wasn't done by... Yeah, the irony is, your legislature was never consulted about this. Your teachers were never consulted about this. Your teachers' unions were never consulted about this. Nobody, and your moms and dads certainly weren't consulted about this. All this was done off the grid, behind closed doors. And so you've got 5 people in these 2 lobbyist groups, and one name I want to share with you in particular. The man who's called the chief architect of Common Core, the man most responsible, is a fellow by the name of David Coleman, C-O-L-E-M-A-N. And the liberal Huffington Post calls David Coleman the most powerful education official that nobody's ever heard of. He is, on his Wikipedia page, he is considered the architect of the standards. He, more than anybody else, oversaw the process. Do you know what he's doing now? No sooner did David Coleman write the standards, orchestrate them, than he immediately left Common Core. And right now, he's the president of the college boards, where the same guy who wrote the standards is now in charge of rewriting the SATs, the exams your kids are going to have to take to get into college, to conform to his Common Core standards. You see how staggering that is. Another little tidbit about David Coleman, he has no educational training whatsoever, ever, nothing. He's never taught a classroom, he's never had a class of education, he's never studied educational theory, he's never educated children or high school kids, none, 0, nada, no experience. He wrote the standards with the help of other people, and now the feds allowed him to become in charge of the tests your kids are going to have to take to get into college. Do you see, homeschool moms and dads, the potential existential threat of this? You educate your kids at home, in a godly or a conservative or a traditional manner. And now when they get to the point where they graduate from high school and they want to go to college, the ACTs and the SATs will be Common Core compliant. So without having to threaten homeschooling at all, simply by allowing the same guy nobody's ever heard of to write the standards and then take over at the college boards, they've already blackmailed states and schools. Why did 176 Roman Catholic diocese schools take Common Core the first time they could without being asked to? Because of this. They're terrified. It's kind of moral cowardice. But they're terrified that in a few years, their kids won't look as good on the tests. And that if the kids don't look as good on the tests, you're not going to spend all that money to send your kids to the schools. So we got to start conforming, right? Half the Protestant schools, Lutheran schools, Methodist schools, Baptist, about 50% of them have already gone Common Core. Because they're terrified. I call this is educational terrorism. When you allow unaccountable, unelected people like this behind closed doors to completely transform and take over American education. I mean, think about this. The people who wrote and implemented this paradigm, this Common Core, that is transforming your kids' schools, they're unaccountable to anybody. You, me, anybody. So, okay, so you got 2 Washington lobbyist groups. You got 5 individuals headed by David Coleman. Well, who paid for it? Well, that would be our good friend Bill Gates of Microsoft. As you sit here today, Bill Gates has spent over $6 billion on Common Core. $6 billion of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation money. $6 billion. It won't surprise you, I think, to learn that there's not a single major educational entity in this country that supports Common Core that was not paid to do so by Bill Gates. Gates has paid everybody. All the 501c3s, all the lobbying groups educationally, Gates' money. Was the Roman Catholic Church? Could it be that the Roman Catholic Church is putting Common Core in the schools without even being asked? Because the NCEA, the National Catholic Education Association, the chief watchdog of our Catholic schools, has taken hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants from Bill Gates. Matter of fact, the only thing Bill Gates has spent more of his money on than Common Core is abortion, euthanasia, and birth control in Africa. Kind of a nice partner for the Catholic Church right there. How about the National PTA? The National PTA, whose job it is to watch out for our kids, right? They've taken 4 different $1 million grants from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Do you know the National PTA was advertising for Common Core in the States before the standards were even written, before they'd even seen them? This is what Gates has done. And can I ask you, what qualifies Bill Gates to be in charge of American education? What qualifies? The thing that's so ironic about this is that these people have no qualifications for what they've done. So you got a billionaire in Bill Gates who paid for it. You got 5 individuals and 2 lobbying groups. All right. That doesn't tell me why it's federal. In fact, that sounds anything but federal. 2 private lobbying groups, 5 individuals, Bill Gates. Well, how did it get in American government schools? How did it get there? You know, you've been watching your government for the last 40 years, right? Whether there's been Democrats or Republicans in office. Is this a federal government that just lets you walk in and do things that it does? No way. You think the Federal Department of Education is going to let people off the grid take over? No. So how did it get in your schools? I don't care how many billions of dollars Gates has. He does not have the power to put this in your schools. It was the federal government, the Department of Education. How many of you have heard of the Federal Race to the Top program? Remember what that was? Remember back in 2008, 2009, when the outgoing Republican Bush and the incoming Democrat Obama told us that unless we coughed up billions and billions of taxpayer dollars, banks and car companies, the whole economy would crash. What you don't know, you'll hear it today, is that over $1 billion of that absolutely critical stimulus money was turned right over to the Department of Education. And they used it to begin to create the tests that will go along with these standards. The feds did it. The Race to the Top program was basically a stimulus for education. In 2009, the federal government started offering grants to every state in the union. For example, in 2009, New York became the first state in the union to receive a Race to the Top grant. They got $700 million from the feds, your money. It went right to the New York Department of Education, and they could spend it on whatever they wanted to. Substitute teachers, computers, right? Anything they wanted. Do you know what the only meaningful proviso in Race to the Top was? Any state that took Race to the Top money was legally obligated to accept the Common Core state standards when they were finally written. That's how 46 states, including yours, got it. They took some form of Race to the Top money, and in so doing, they signed a contract. When they took that money, they had to accept the English and the math standards when they were written. That's how. In other words, your federal government bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards that nobody had seen. It's true that after Massachusetts took the standards, that some people, some teachers, educators in your state got to see them, but they couldn't change them, they couldn't edit them, they couldn't revise them, they couldn't reject them. Your state took it, they got to see it. That's about all that happened. And that's the whole 9 yards on this. Again, this is so easy to verify. Even the pro-Common Core people don't really want to argue about it anymore. How many of you have heard, can we just talk about the standards? They're just standards. Because they don't want to talk. I think it matters how you got them. Let me give you an example of why it matters. Do you think the people who support Common Core right now would still support it if they were exactly the same standard, but instead of Bill Gates and his $6 billion, it was, I don't know, the evil Koch brothers who threw in $6 billion? What do you think the newspapers would be saying every day if it were the Koch brothers who put $6 billion into this mess? Wouldn't at the front, all your ravingly liberal Massachusetts newspapers, wouldn't they be talking about how rogue billionaire buys public education? Wouldn't they? And by the way, they'd be right to ask those questions. That was Gates. Isn't it funny that nobody's ever asked that question about Gates? 6 years into this, $1 billion a year Gates has pumped into this, and nobody's ever asked that question. You know, it's been estimated, and we'll see this a little bit further, that at least 70% of American schools are going to have to radically upgrade their technology, their computer capacity, their bandwidth, to be able to offer the kind of test Common Core requires. Whose computers do you think are going in those schools? They're Gates computers, right? But nobody asked this question. Why is it, and this is what gets me, that whenever we talk about Common Core, we're always told that those who don't like it are politicizing it. How come nobody ever asked the politics of the being rated this? How come nobody ever has asked what the political motivations were, who the people who did? So off-the-grid people do this. The feds put it in your schools. And when we ask questions, we're the ones politicizing it. Because that's the way the media works. But you get my point, right? If it had been the Koch brothers who put in $6 billion, and instead of a very liberal president, you had a very conservative one, who basically bribed 46 states to take a set of curriculum standards nobody had seen with taxpayer money, I guarantee you your superintendents would hate it. They'd fight it tooth and nail. Your newspapers would be relentless in condemning this. But they're not. And that's where you sit right now. So, the problems with Common Core started immediately. And I say this too, I said this in the afternoon talk, and I mean this. For simply criticizing what they did, for simply trying to alert people to what the situation is, they call you, the whole argument on the pro-Common Core side is about, I'm going to give you the whole argument. Anybody who opposes Common Core is a tinfoil hat wearing, teabagging, right-wing political lunatic. That's the argument. And tell me we haven't seen this before, by the way. I mean, this is exactly what they do. You remember when during the Obamacare debate, where you were told if you oppose Obamacare, you just want people to die in the streets? That was successful, wasn't it? Remember the last presidential campaign, where you were told that if you didn't support the latest feminist agenda with regards to abortion, then you just was waging a war on women. Remember that one? And it's the same thing with Common Core. If you oppose Common Core, well, you just don't want standards for your kids, right? And in other words, you can have our standards or no standards, right? Not the standards, Massachusetts, that you already had, that were created by Massachusetts people, and that were really, really world class. You can't have those standards, right? So you got rid of the good ones and took these. But I decided, I made a decision about a year and a half ago in doing these talks, and I was only met with that. Right winger, right winger, right winger. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rest of the day, and I'm going to show you why Common Core isn't going to work, why it's a fiasco, and why it's a disaster. Why it's going to indoctrinate, not educate your kids. But I'm going to show you exclusively through left-wing voices. Every piece of information I'm going to show you comes from the left, and it's oftentimes the radical left. Because if the only argument is this is a right-wing problem, it's made up, then let's see how you call these people right-wingers, okay? Let's start with the two chief lawyers at the Department of Education when this mess started. The two lawyers who the Department of Education hired to make sure they were being faithful and legally within the parameters of the Constitution. Both of those lawyers said, no, the Department of Education has overstepped its boundaries. What the Department of Education is doing is illegal. Here are they, right? With respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education concluded that, quote, these standards and the tests, the assessments, will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the Union, running the risk that states become little more than administrative agents for a national K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the department has exceeded its statutory boundaries. Now that they're no longer with the Department of Ed, they've written a 40-page white paper available free of charge at the Pioneer Institute, where they lay out the illegality, the case of Common Core. And you can go see that yourself. All right, again, I'm an English professor, so words are my business, but I'm going to play a little word game with you. I'm going to give you 5 words. And I want you to tell me if there's any way you can rewrite these 5 words to make them come out conservative. Are you ready? New York State Teachers Union. What do you think? Any way you could turn that? Well, because look, a year ago in January, the Board of New York's Teachers Union on Saturday unanimously voted to withdraw support for the Common Core standards as they are being implemented, and they want that guy fired. He's the guy, this is not state-led. In your state, the governor and your superintendent of schools made the decision. In New York, that man alone did. He's the superintendent of public schools. The legislatures weren't consulted, the taxpayers, the voters, the teachers unions, none of them were consulted. One individual in most cases made this decision, took money, and you got stuck with all of this. The New York State United Teachers, a union that represents more than 600,000 educational professionals in the state of New York, is also asking the Board of Regents to remove John King from office. And although the union previously backed the Common Core standards, it now says it will not support the education benchmarks, quote, either as implemented or interpreted. Not the way you wrote them, and not if you try to revise them. Just get rid of them. That's New York. How about the NEA, the National Education Association? How about the largest teachers union in the country? And now that the UAW has had was kneecapped by the federal government, that's the most politically active union in the country. When my governor, Scott Walker, took on the teachers unions in Wisconsin and beat them, he was recalled. That union spent over $150 million of its teachers' dues trying to get Governor Walker thrown out of office, and they failed. So this is no right-leaning organization. Here's what they said in February of last year. The nation's largest teachers union is pulling back on its once enthusiastic support for the Common Core state standards, labeling the rollout, quote, completely botched, unquote. National Education Association President Dennis Van Roekel said, quote, the standards will not succeed without a major course correction, including rewriting the standards and revising the tests with teacher input. That's a big deal. The second thing that makes Common Core absolutely federal is the fact that the only way we have to measure it are these big national tests. The only way your kids are going to be evaluated on Common Core are those multi-week tests they have to take. Who controls those tests? It's not the state of Massachusetts. It's not the governor of Massachusetts. It's not the teachers. Those tests are controlled through Washington, D.C. All the data and information gathered on your kids, it reports to the Capitol that report to you. That's why it's federal. Because whoever controls those tests controls what your kids do and what your teachers teach. Your teachers are primarily going to be evaluated now on how well they get their kids to do on those tests. So consequently, whoever controls the tests controls the teachers. We're going to see a little bit more of that coming up. It's kind of a big deal, isn't it? And what the union's telling you is, you can't evaluate teachers on tests they didn't write, tests they don't get to see, tests they don't get to revise, tests the results of which they don't get for the individual kids sitting in their classes. How do you hold teachers accountable for that? And you guys get this, right? It's not like the unions have suddenly had a come to Jesus moment and are going to vote for conservative governor to have president next time. But this proves the point I'm trying to make. The unions have woken, who all dramatically supported this at first because it's big government, it's big money being spent. Now they don't want it. Why? Because they realize that they are not in control of their teachers anymore. The feds are in control of all of it. And if I have to choose between the unions and the feds, I'll hold my nose and choose the teachers' unions every time. Because this federal government, as you're going to see, right? But you know how it is in politics, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. It is just shocking that they continue to tell you that Common Core is a tinfoil hat right-wing issue. It's not. The screams and howls from the left are every bit as deafening as from the right. And by the way, Dennis Van Roekel is not the president of the NEA anymore. He lost the presidency to a woman, a female candidate, who ran on an anti-Common Core program. How's that? Right?
All right.
And now you got, how about the nation's second largest teachers union? How about the American Federation of Teachers? Oh, and this by far is the more progressively radical of the two unions. This is the really left-wing one. And notice the date, 8 months ago in July. In a major surprise, the American Federation of Teachers, the country's second largest teachers union, opened its convention by announcing a step back from support for Common Core. The AFT will now provide monetary grants to teachers who want to criticize the standards or even write entirely new ones. Think about what that means. If you're a teacher in a state like Massachusetts, and the teachers union wants Common Core, and the state wants Common Core, how do you dare speak out against it? You've got no protection. People keep saying, well, teachers seem to like Common Core. They've got no choice. The ones who don't like it have been, I got a folder at home this big from all the states I've been to. Letters from superintendents and principals threatening teachers. This is America. You have the right to free speech, but not in this classroom. You either get on board with Common Core or you find yourself a new job. And you know what's interesting? In a state like New York, where the teachers union backed out of Common Core, guess what's happening in New York now? Teachers are speaking out by the thousands. Why? Because the teachers know now that if they speak out, the union will support them if the state tries to fire them. In a state like Massachusetts, where the teachers are caught between the union, who's going along, and the state, how do you voice? So you're a teacher, what do you do? Right? You have no control over this. Your career is based on how your kids do on these exams that you have no say over. The AFT's executive council, well, we said that. How about this? Common Core has also seen other opposition from the left as well, particularly from a new faction of almost 100,000 left-wing teachers who call themselves the Badass Teachers Association. And many of whose members also belong to the AFT. The Badass Teachers, or the BATs, they're over about 150,000 now. They formed almost exclusively to fight Common Core from the left. Believe it or not, the Badass Teachers are standing arm in arm with Tea Party activists across the country because they both have this in common. And what do they both agree on? What Common Core does to special needs kids and the kids who are already struggling. It's the kiss of death for those kids. And that's why these two groups have mobilized. And one of my personal favorites, how about President Obama's backyard? How about the Chicago Teachers Union? And when you say the Chicago Teachers Union, by the way, this has got to be the most radical, progressive, crazy city teachers union in the country. Do you know who their Martin Luther King Day speaker was for the elementary school kids? The Reverend Jeremiah Wright. Kind of hard to turn that into a right-wing group, right? The lady in the picture, that's Karen Lewis. She is the president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And, you know, Karen is an avowed Marxist socialist. That's her politics. And she was actually good, and you know how I know she's a Marxist socialist? She was going to run for mayor of Chicago, and she was going to run to the left of Rahm Emanuel. See, I didn't think you could get anything but dryer lint between the left and Rahm Emanuel. But she was going to run. Now, I think she's developed cancer, so she dropped out of the race. But she's still the president of the Chicago Union. Let me give you a direct quote. This is all direct quote from Karen Lewis, and notice the date. May of 2014. Quote, "I agree with educators and parents from across the country. The Common Core mandate represents an overreach of federal power into personal privacy." That's all the data gathering. "It also represents an overreach of federal power into state educational autonomy." Can I just put my professor hat back on for one more minute? The word of the day, kids, is irony. I will use it in a sentence. It is ironic that a Marxist socialist sees Common Core as too much government. Now that's she's right. When you got Karen Lewis telling you that Common Core is too much government involvement, all right? How about this? Do we have any teachers here, by the way? Okay, teachers, you hold me accountable if I'm telling a lie here, right? Karen Lewis says, "Common Core eliminates creativity in the classroom and impedes collaboration." As teachers, aren't there days when you have to close the book, set the curriculum aside, because you've got 25 kids staring at you with deer-in-the-headlight looks? The best teachers are the ones who can go off script, who can create, who can put everything away and figure out how to reach the kids sitting in front of them. How do you do that when the whole thing is orchestrated? How do you do that when the whole thing is top-down, screwed? You can't. Screwed down, you can't. That's what Karen Lewis is telling you. We also know, and she's right about this, we also know that high-stakes standardized tests are designed to rank and sort our children, and they contribute significantly to racial discrimination and the achievement gap in American schools. And she's 100% right. You know, do you honestly think, does anybody honestly think, you're going to create one exam for 60 million kids and it's going to tell you anything? There is no way you can create one exam for every third grader in the country that's going to tell your teacher what your daughter's doing in that class. It's impossible. They prove nothing, these tests. They are meaningless. And yet, we've been doing standardized testing for 40 years. By the way, did anybody know when this crave for national testing started? It really got started when we created the Department of Education. We managed to educate American kids quite well in this country for a couple hundred years, until we created the Department of Education. And all those billions of dollars that used to go directly to the states now had to funnel through the Department of Education. So they wanted to hold on to as much of that money as they could. So what did they do? They hired, believe it or not, they hired textbook companies like Pearson, McGraw-Hill. They hired textbook companies to create big national exams. And guess what those exams in the early 80s proved? Gee, our kids are stupid all of a sudden. Wait, so you got textbook companies whose job it is to sell you new stuff every year. And their tests proved that our kids were failing. You know, think about it. I was alive in the 1970s. I was very young, but I was alive. And I remember the 1970s. It's not like in the 1970s, moms and dads started saying, gee, our kids are stupid. It's not like universities like the one I teach at in Wisconsin started turning kids away because they didn't know anything. Who concluded that our kids were failing? It wasn't teachers, it wasn't parents, it wasn't colleges, it was these exams. So guess what we had to do? We threw out all the curriculum, all the pedagogy, all the textbooks, we had to buy all new. And you notice over the last 40 years, every 4 or 5 years we throw everything out and start over. Because who's making money off of this, right? The people who wrote the tests. Do you know how much money the Smarter Balance and the Park consortiums are making every year testing your kids? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. And the tests prove nothing. And that's why I'm confident that sooner or later Common Core will go away. Not because we'll get rid of the idea, but because we'll rename it and have to sell you more stuff. Right? That's what this is. I mean, think about it. We managed to put a man on the moon. We created the generation, we educated the generation that put a man on the moon with less technology available to them than your cell phone. The phone in your pocket has more technology on it than the stuff we use to get people to the moon. And we somehow characterize that educational system as a failure. Who did it? These people, the Department of Education, big government, in conjunction with a couple of hand-picked companies. Can I give you one more point? And we got teachers here, you hold me accountable. Nothing has changed as far as mathematics education. Nothing has changed in math for kids from 5 years old to 15 years old. Nothing. Have we invented a new number and slipped it in somewhere? Have we been inventing new geometrical theorems that I'm over? No. I get that when you're dealing with calculus But I'm talking about 90% of your kids' math education in elementary, middle, and high school. It hasn't changed in 2,000 years. And if that's true, shouldn't you be able to buy one textbook and use it for 60 years? Of course. And if that's the case, then companies like Pearson make no money. And so what is this all about, Common Core? What it is you've got a small group of crony capitalist companies, like Microsoft, for instance, who are getting rich doing this. And what does the government get? They get power and control, right? And that's what Marxist socialist Karen Lewis is telling you. And not only did Karen Lewis say this personally, but the Chicago Teachers Union crafted 30 different anti-Common Core resolutions. Can't read them all, just read you a couple. Here's the Chicago resolution. Quote, instructional and curriculum decisions should be in the hands of classroom teachers who understand the context and interests of their students. Doesn't that make sense? The professional educators should be the ones to try to determine the best way to teach. It's not going to happen in Common Core. How about this? The education of children should be grounded in developmentally appropriate practice. The first person to tell you that Common Core is not appropriate education for your kids isn't me. I'll tell you a lot. It's the Chicago Teachers Union. And we'll see that. She's right about that, too. And this is really big. Notice the date here. A couple months ago, January 2015, the entire Washington State Democrat Party called for an immediate pullout of Common Core from the state of Washington. This is a big deal. If you're a Democrat in Washington, and let's face it, Washington State is every bit the big liberal state that Massachusetts is. Right? And so if you're going to run for office in Washington State, and let's face it, most people who run for office in Washington State are Democrats. If you're going to run, you have to adopt this plan, or you get no state money. A couple of months ago, and if I didn't tell you it was the Washington State Democrat Party, you would think what you're about to hear came right from a Tea Party. Listen to what the Washington State Democrats said. The Central Committee of the Washington State Democrat Party passed a resolution roundly condemning the Common Core standards. This is the first time a statewide Democrat Party committee has taken a public position against Common Core, and it happened in the backyard of the Gates Foundation, who paid for all of this. So in Chicago, Barack Obama's backyard, the Chicago Union has absolutely repudiated it. In the state of Washington, Seattle, where Gates has his organization, the whole state Democrat Party has repudiated it. Here's the resolution. Whereas the copyrighted and therefore unchangeable Common Core standards are a set of controversial, top-down academic standards that were promulgated by wealthy private interests without any research-based evidence that they're going to work, and that are developmentally inappropriate in the lowest grades. And whereas, as a means of avoiding the U.S. Constitution's 10th Amendment prohibition against federal meddling in state education policy, can I just do a little dance? You got Democrats fighting the Constitution? Whereas, as a means of avoiding the Constitution, state-led, you say? 2 private, unaccountable trade associations, the MGA and the CCSSO, have received millions of dollars in funding from the Gates Foundation, whereas the U.S. Department of Education improperly pressured state legislatures into adopting the Common Core and the high-stakes tests as a condition of competing for federal race to the top stimulus funds. Money that should have been doled out based on need, not on coercion, and whereas the implementation of Common Core is going to cost local school districts hundreds of millions of dollars to pay for standardized computer-based tests, new technology, new curricula, and teacher training, at a time when Washington State is already insufficiently funding K-12 basic education, all this for something that has no proven benefit to students. And whereas states have already begun the process of pulling out of Common Core, therefore be it resolved that we call upon the Washington State Legislature and the Superintendent of Public Instruction to withdraw from Common Core and keep K-12 education student-centered and accountable to the people of Washington State. That's amazing. And Massachusetts, how come the liberals that run your state aren't looking out for your kids the way they are? Because this has nothing to do with right-wing morons, as they call us, right? Nothing to do, there's no tinfoil anywhere near this. Look, you give me a week, I'll lay out the whole conservative case against Common Core. You give me another week, I'll lay out Christian scholars' objection to Common Core. But we don't even need to go there. Because obviously, we live in a weird world, don't we? Where the political letter in front of your name determines whether your facts are true or not. Okay, fair enough. Don't listen to me, don't argue with me. Let's see what these people are doing. I don't see a conservative in the room yet. All right, up on the board here. How about this? I mentioned this to you. You took roughly $600 million, Massachusetts, one way or another. More, probably, if we ever had an accurate auditing of your books. But certainly no less than $600 million you took to take this nonsense. That's more than it's going to cost your state in 1 year just to do the testing. Did you get your money's worth? Let me give you an example. California. The state of California, notice the date here, 3 months ago, January 3rd, 29th, 2015. The state of California could be liable for as much as $1 billion a year in costs if a group of California school districts succeeds in winning reimbursement for expenses associated with the implementation of computer-based tests in the Common Core and other standards. 4 unified California school districts, Santa Ana, Vallejo, Plumas, and Porterville, and the Plumas County Office of Education, filed a claim to classify the new tests as state mandates. Well, of course they are. No school district in California took the standards. The state took it. The state took it and said, you're going to have to teach it. Then guess who's responsible for paying for the tests? It's not the schools, it's the state. And when we say the state, that means who's going to pay for this?
We are.
You are, right? Now, I know they call you Massachusetts. I know that. I heard that in Wisconsin, right?
Yeah.
But can you afford every year what you're going to have to spend? Is it worth the money to spend? This is California. If the Commission on State Mandates agrees, and I don't see how they can't, if the State Mandate Commission says no, it's not the state's responsibility, then those schools are going to have to shut their doors, aren't they? Where do they come up with this money? And so what happens? The districts contend that unlike the old pencil and paper tests, the new computer-based tests require districts to buy computers, expand internet bandwidth capacity, install wireless connections, hire computer technicians, and train staff. In its filing, Santa Ana, the biggest of the 4 school districts with about 50,000 students, said it expects to spend about $12 million this year and last year alone on devices and bandwidth expansion, including another $124,000 on staff time. The claim estimates that the statewide cost for all districts for 1 year to test these kids at $1 billion. Jesus. California took about $900 million to take Common Core. You got ripped off, right? They took $900 million. They're going to spend all that this year alone just to test those kids. And then, this is state-led, right? Okay, it's state-led. If it's state-led, then why are the feds threatening every state that wants to pull out? Note the date here, January 31st, 2015. I already explained Chicago to you. So this is what's wonderful. The entire state of Illinois is on board with Common Core. The entire state of Illinois is testing all their kids, except the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago said they're only going to offer these meaningless tests to 10% of their student body. That's it. And for that, the federal government is threatening to withhold Illinois' entire education budget for this year. How do you argue that it's state-led when that's happening? Chicago Public Schools' decision to administer new tests, Common Core tests, to only about 10% of the city's 600 schools could cost the state over $1 billion in federal aid. In a recent letter to Illinois School Superintendent Christopher Koch from Assistant U.S. Education Secretary Deborah Delisle, made it clear the state could lose as much as $1.17 billion in federal education funding next year if Chicago schools don't comply with Common Core testing requirements. Do you understand now what I mean when I say whoever controls these tests controls what your kids do, what your teachers teach. That's why the feds are threatening. The whole state of Illinois is on board, except for this one district, right? And for that, the feds say, you either test all those kids, every one of them, or we're cutting you completely off. The states have nothing to do with this. This is a federal takeover of education. And you're going to be the ones paying for it. But don't listen to me. Because, you know, I got my silly little Wisconsin shoes on. You may not like bald guys. I understand. The great thing about all this is you don't have to listen to me. Because the people who did this to you told you exactly why they were doing it. How many of you have heard the argument that Common Core is rigorous? How many of you have heard the argument that Common Core has been measured and benchmarked? Okay, let's listen to what Bill Gates has to say about this. Here's Bill Gates in 2013.
It would be great if our education stuff worked, but that we won't know for probably a decade.
So in 2013, 2 years ago, Bill Gates said, it would be nice to know if our education stuff is going to work. But we're not going to know that for 10 years. How can you argue it's rigorous when they don't even know it's going to work? How can you argue it's been benchmarked when the guy who paid for it says, it'll be 2013 before we have any idea if it works? You know, way back in 2002 when George Bush gave us No Child Left Behind, it took about 10 years before we figured out it was a disaster and got rid of it. How much money was thrown down that rat hole? And you're going to wait another 10. How many kids have been miseducated in that generation? Now you're going to throw more money down this rat hole for what? The difference between Common Core and No Child Left Behind, by the way, the only difference is that if you don't stop Common Core, then you will never be able to fix education in Massachusetts again because it'll all devolve from the feds. You still, Massachusetts, if you got your act together, could reassert control over your kids' education. You could tomorrow reinstate the Massachusetts standards that you used before this. If you did that, then the feds would be out of your hair. Oh, and keep in mind, too, that $1.17 billion that the feds are cutting from Illinois, that's less than 7% of the state's overall education budget. Does that give you a sense of the magnitude of numbers we're talking here? The feds are going to withhold over $1 billion from Illinois. That's only 6% of what Illinois spends on education every year. But now ask yourself this. Do you understand, Massachusetts, how easy it would be for you to make up that? In your case, it's 5%. The money you get from the federal government amounts to about 5% of what you spend every year on education in the state. Get the feds out of it. You could make that 5% up easy, right? You would add another toll. My God, add another toll. Right? And dedicate it. You make that 5% up. You pay that 5% yourself, and that you can tell the feds to kiss your behind. You don't do anything they say. You had better standards. What did you sell your soul for? And how many of you have heard? Now, I think the single biggest, the most dangerous lie of Common Core is this one. How many of you have heard this? Common Core is just a set of standards. It's not curriculum. Teachers can teach what they want. We'll think about that for a second. Your teachers went home one bright June morning for summer vacation. They came back in September, and all the textbooks had been pulled. And in their place were new Common Core textbooks, or better yet, a lot of uploaded stuff onto the computers by companies like Pearson. How did your teachers learn how to teach Common Core? The only thing they had was the pedagogy, the textbooks. The idea that the standards, you can reach the standards any way you want is BS. All the old textbooks are gone. So your teachers are being forced to teach from what's been handed to them. And the textbook companies who did this, companies like Pearson, they were in the room working with the Common Core people about how to create the textbooks. How do you argue they're separate? Well, don't listen to me. Let's listen to Bill Gates on this. Listen to this little gem.
We'll only know if this effort has succeeded when the curriculum and tests are aligned to these standards. Secretary Arne Duncan recently announced that $350 million of the stimulus package will be used to create just these kinds of tests. Next generation assessments aligned to the Common Core. When the tests are aligned to the common standards, the curriculum will line up as well.
When the tests are aligned to the Common Core standards, and right now your kids are being tested, then the curriculum will line up. When your teachers, as they're finding out right now, figure out that the only thing on those tests is the Common Core stuff, they will have no choice but to teach what we want them to. Do you understand the insidiousness of this? And did you also hear him admit that that money got siphoned away from the stimulus package and given to Arnie Duncan? Arnie Duncan, your Secretary of Education. You know he's never been a classroom teacher. How do we elect the highest education, appoint, I should say, to the highest educational office in the land, somebody who's never been a teacher? Do you know what Arnie Duncan's background is in? He's a sociologist. That makes perfect sense. And a basketball player, yeah.
And boy, love really.
And there's that too, right? Both David Coleman and Bill Gates happen to be homosexuals, right? Not Bill Gates, I'm sorry, David Coleman and Arnie Duncan. And the interesting thing about this is, with regards to the question of that $350 million stimulus, why would you appoint a sociologist to the chief educational office in the country? Well, I think you're already beginning to see that Common Core really was never meant to be about education, it's about sociology. It's about reshaping your kids, about driving a wedge between parents, and you'll see that coming out between parents and children, about convincing your kids that they belong primarily to the state and not to you. You'll see that very shortly. But, again, don't listen to me. You really think that these are benign standards that give your teachers all kinds of flexibility to meet them? Well, that's David Coleman. That's the guy who wrote them. Now in charge of the SATs and all the advanced placement exams your kids are going to have to take. He's rewriting. I want you to listen to what David Coleman said about your teachers' freedom. Because your state politicians have been guaranteeing you our teachers are free. Your state teachers union has been telling you we can teach what we want. Okay, will you gonna believe them, or are you gonna believe the guy who wrote the standards?
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand waving. There's no amount of saying they teach the standards, not the test. We don't do that here. Whatever.
He's bigger than the president. He's bigger than the king. There is no force on this earth that's going to prevent your teachers to teaching to our test. So when you go and you take this to your principal and your superintendent, they're going to look at you glassy-eyed and tell you the lie again. No, our teachers are. Okay. They're going to tell you this was state-led, the governors did this. All they've got left is repeating the lies. There's nothing else. There is no argument. There is no evidence for anything they tell you. That's what's so maddening about this. You don't need me. The people who did this told you what they were doing. I'm going to play that again. Short clip. Take it from him. Listen to the arrogance. Listen to the definitiveness of this.
Which is teachers will teach towards the test. There is no force strong enough on this earth to prevent that. There's no amount of hand waving. There's no amount of saying they teach the standards, not the test. We don't do that here. Whatever.
There's David Coleman. And how about the future president of the United States?
Oh my God.
1 week ago, 5 days ago, in Iowa, he was asked about Common Core. 5 days ago. Listen to this.
You know, when I think about the really unfortunate argument that's been going on around Common Core, it's very painful. How did we end up at a point where we are so negative about the most important non-family enterprise in the raising of the next generation, which is how our kids are educated?
The most important non-family enterprise is education. She's already cut you out. They're not your kids. They do not belong to you. You do not have the primacy of what and when and what and how they learn. Education is the single most important non-family thing your kids are ever going to do. And there's the successor to all of this. Right? And if you're a homeschool mom and dad, you tell me what you just heard there. You tell me how you think. It may not, the homeschooling's not going away tomorrow or next year or even in 5 years. But you tell me with an attitude like that, how long, if they nail down Common Core, you tell me how long you're going to be free to do this. the most important non-family, and I can think of nothing more family-oriented than education. I can think of no thing more central to the evolution, the development, the progress, the maturity of your kids in education. And she's cut you out, and the feds have cut you out. Not good. Go to this center, the Center for Teaching Quality, February 2015. They've done a very detailed analysis-based examination of how much time is going to be spent testing for Common Core in every class year. Fourth graders, the average fourth grader in this country is going to spend 51 days of a 180-day school year testing. And keep in mind that fourth grade isn't even one of the main testing years. Third grade is. Testing, prepping, and it makes sense. If the only thing your teachers are getting evaluated out of these tests, then they're going to have to prepare them for the tests. They're going to have to practice tests. They're going to have to test repeatedly. And if they're doing all that testing, guess what they're not doing? They're learning. Exactly. And you know the thing that gets me about all of this? Ever since the Department of Education started meddling in this, and if you look at when American education really starts to waffle and fall, it's in the late 1970s. Once you centralize education, the Department of Education, everything but education became the Department of Education's issue. We've had 50 different academic studies done in the last 40 years, 50 of them, about the impact of standards at the state level and the federal level on college classroom, high school, middle school performance. Do you know what every one of those surveys, statistical analysis have proven? There is absolutely no connection between state standards and how your kids perform in the class. There's absolutely no connection between federal standards and how your kids perform in the classrooms. One of the brilliant things about the Massachusetts standards is that they really weren't state standards at all. They empowered classrooms to reach certain objectives. They didn't take power away. Here's the dirty little secret. Do you know what the only standard that has ever worked in any classroom, ever? The only one? You need a committed parent, a disciplined child, and an effective teacher. That's it. That's all. You got those three. We became a superpower, did we not? On the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses, as Mary Calomia is going to tell you. Right? If you've got a good teacher, and you've got disciplined kids, and you've got a parent who's involved, that's how you teach our kids. You understand now that Common Core is as far removed from the autonomy of that little triad you could possibly get, unless the United Nations were to take over education. And don't think it's not possible. You know Bill Gates, and you can find this online, in 2004.
It's very possible.
Bill Gates, as a private citizen, signed a mutual agreement pact with UNESCO, the United Nations Education Organization, to bring exactly this kind of education from America to the rest of the world. Right now, you're not going to believe this. I got to throw a slide up here, but you're not going to believe this. This is one of those things I'll let you go find out. You research it for yourself. Do you know who the third largest private donor to Common Core is after Bill Gates and after Pearson Publishing? It's the Muammar Gaddafi family. I kid you not. Common Core, right? Pearson Publishing has opened publishing houses in Kuwait and Qatar. American Common Core is now going into Middle East schools in places like Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait already. That explains why, if you've been watching Common Core, moms and dads are really upset because there's so much Muslim advocacy in various textbooks that are associated with Common Core. Pearson, there's got to be a quid pro quo, right? If the Gaddafis and people like them are pumping money into this, that's what they get out of it. There's nothing in the Common Core standards themselves that mandates Islamic apologetics, but by pairing and partnering Pearson with all the Emirate states of the Gulf, that's what they get back, right? More crony capitalists.